Oh no. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever applies to you. I hope you're well and welcome to Big Foodie Geek, and I am the Big Foodie Geek. Now this video today came about because it is the end of the month, it is towards the end of March, it is still a good few days before payday, and I am absolutely broke and I am running low on food. So I'm kind of also running low on ideas of what to do with the food that I have got in the place. So I thought, what can I do with a video with only the few bits and pieces that I've got around? But also this last week, I've also seen something very interesting about a bit of AI called Chat GPT. And I hadn't really heard of it before last week, and then suddenly it came up twice in 1 week. So I thought, got to check this out for myself. So Chat GPT is basically a website you can go on, and it is powered by a AI, or rather it's got an AI on it, and you can go on and ask it questions or ask it to do things for you. And one example of something I saw it do was making a recipe, or rather writing a recipe for you based on ingredients that you put into it. And I thought that would be perfect to try out, to see if it could come up with a recipe for me based on the few bits and pieces that I've got still in the kitchen before I can actually stock up again once I get paid. So I had a bit of a look through my freezer, my fridge and my cupboards and stuff to kind of see what I've got. And the three main things that I kind of really have at the moment is some red onions, potatoes, good old potatoes, always keep some of those around. And in my freezer I have a pork knuckle. Now I've never made pork knuckle before, so I thought getting it to write me a recipe based on pork knuckle would be a great idea, because it might be able to give me some ideas. I've had this pork knuckle since about December. My mum gave it to me last time I went down there. She sent it back up with me, so I put it in my freezer because I didn't know what I was going to do with it straight away. And I thought now's a good time to try it out. Let's see if ChatGPT can actually write me a recipe for pork knuckle, and see if I can actually do something with it, and see if this AI can actually write a decent recipe based on these few ingredients. It's going to be interesting. I've seen an example of this done once on sorted food before, and they had mixed results, but it looked really promising. And I've tried it out myself, and it looks like it's come up with a pretty decent recipe. So I went onto the website, I loaded it up. Thankfully it was working, because it has been down a bit because it's getting very popular and lots of people want to try it out, so they've been having to take it down for maintenance and stuff like that. But I went onto the website and asked it to write me a recipe using pork knuckle, potatoes and red onion. And it spat out a recipe for me using those three ingredients, and also some other store cupboard ingredients, things that you should probably still have around anyway in your cupboards or in your fridge or whatever. So it wrote the recipe using the three main ingredients, the pork knuckle, the potatoes and the red onion, but then it also added on things like garlic, olive oil, dried thyme, dried rosemary, salt, black pepper, and chicken or vegetable stock. And these are all things I do thankfully have, because they are store cupboard ingredients. So this recipe will work for me. But one thing I did notice is that the recipe is in American measurements, it's in imperial. So I don't use imperial because I'm here in the UK, so I want to convert it into metric. So I ask it to convert it into metric for me, and it did. It converts it all into metric measurements, which is brilliant because it makes life easier for me, so I don't have to do it myself. But for any recipe, you've got to make sure you have the right equipment. And while it does mention the equipment in the steps as you're going through the recipe, it doesn't explicitly state what they are in one go. So I asked it to let me know what equipment I need for this recipe, and it gave me a list and explained why I needed them. So that's very impressive in itself, because it spits it out in a manner that is very clear indeed, and what equipment you need and why you need it and what you need it for. But then I thought, in the freezer I've actually got some frozen vegetables. I've got some frozen broccoli in the freezer, because frozen veg is actually great. They freeze it as soon as it's picked, basically, so it's actually really fresh. And it's actually sometimes fresher than what you get in the fresh veg aisle, because obviously the fresh veg aisle has been sat out there for however long it's been transported and things like that, whereas the veg that you actually get from the frozen section has been frozen on the day it's been picked, so it's actually wound up fresher. The only caveat is that it sometimes changes the texture of it when it's frozen and then cooked, so that's something you have to bear in mind. But in terms of freshness, it's actually fresher. So I asked it, can I add frozen vegetables to this recipe? And it came back and it said, yes, you can add frozen vegetables to this recipe, but you have to be careful about when you're putting them in, because it mentions if you put them in too soon or anything like that, they'll get mushy, the texture will change. And it knew all that, and it told me when to put them in, So on this recipe, it says to put them in on the last 30 minutes cooking time, because on this recipe, we're going to be cooking the pork knuckle for about 2.5 hours, and then it's going to be uncovered because it's going to have foil on it. We're going to uncover it, and then it will have another 20 to 30 minutes. So the frozen vegetables can actually go in at that stage, so they're not cooking throughout that whole time and just going to disintegrate. But then I thought, because the AI is asking me to use chicken or vegetable stock, can we mix that up as well? Because I've actually got a load of beer at the moment, or rather alcohol-free beer, because I've got a ton of this Lucky Saint beer, because basically I won a competition last year to win a case of this stuff every month for a year, and it's still going because I've still got 2 cases out there. So I thought, can I use this beer as a way to add flavour as well as the stock? So I asked it, can you add beer to this recipe for me? And it did. So it adjusted the recipe to add this beer into it as well. So it's going to add 120 millilitres of this as well as the stock. But one thing I did notice, after it had added that beer to the recipe, it had converted it back to the US measurements, back to imperial. So I wanted it to convert it back to metric. But one thing I had noticed, that when it had converted the recipe to metric, it said the pork knuckle should be between 950 grams and 1,350 grams. So that's nearly a kilo to about 1.35 kilos. But the pork knuckle I've got here is actually 1.4 kilos, so it's slightly more, so that might adjust the cooking time. So I went back and asked it to convert the recipe back to metric, but also to adjust the recipe so that it is a 1.4 kilogram pork knuckle, and it did that for me as well. It didn't actually change the cooking time because it is literally like another 50 grams worth of pork knuckle, not very much at all, but I wanted to make sure, and it did do it for me. So now I have a recipe ready to go. So I say, let's make it, and let's see if this AI has actually written a decent recipe for me based on what I've told it. And so far, I'm pretty impressed with what it can do. So it's great, but also rather scary. It's not quite Skynet, but still, I'm still a little bit concerned. Maybe this will put like recipe writers out of a job, who knows? But let's find out and see if this recipe written by AI is actually any good. Let's get started. So to get started with our AI pork knuckle recipe, first thing it told me to do is to preheat my oven to 190 degrees C. I've done that, so that is all heated up behind me. And then it says to rinse the pork knuckle and pat it dry with paper towels. Well, I've rinsed the pork knuckle, so I just need to pat it dry. This is actually an important step, because if you don't do this, then the pork knuckle will be wet, damp, and you won't get a nice crispy skin on it, because the skin won't be dry and it won't crisp up. It will have all that moisture in there, and it just won't do what you want it to do, which is crisp up. If you've never had pork knuckle before, or you have had it but didn't know what it was, pork knuckle is actually a cut of meat. It's on the upper leg of the pig, so it's basically the bit above the foot, or the trotter if you like. Not as common piece of meat to have. Generally, you won't get it in the supermarket as much, but you do need to cook it long and slow to get it nice and tender, because it does a lot of work. Obviously, it's on the upper leg, so it's doing a lot of work. The pigs are walking around and stuff like that, and so it's obviously got more muscle on it, not as much fat, but it is still a very nice bit of meat. So cook it long and slow and get a lovely, really nice bit of meat out of it. Next it says, in a small bowl, mix together the minced garlic, dried thyme, dried rosemary, salt and black pepper. Now, one thing I have noticed looking back at the recipe, it has spat out the herbs basically in milliliters. Now that could be confusing for some people, but that actually converts to grams pretty much 1 for 1. Or what these actually are, these are measurements for teaspoons and half teaspoons. So 5 milliliters works out at a teaspoon, 2.5 is half a teaspoon. So that works as well, so that's fine. But if you want to be ultra short, you could then ask it to convert those measurements again to grams or teaspoons if you like. So I already peeled and minced up my 4 garlic cloves. So I'll add in a teaspoon of the dried thyme, dried rosemary, salt, and that salt will help draw more of that moisture out of that skin hopefully, and the half teaspoon of black pepper. Just get my hands in there and just mix that all together. And it says to rub this mixture all over the pork knuckle. Now it hasn't said to add oil or anything at this time. The oil will be going in the pan by the looks of things. So we'll just get this all rubbed well over the pork knuckle, all over all sides. There we go, that's all over the pork knuckle as best as I very can, so I'll put this to one side now. Then for the next step, it says in a large roasting pan, combine the diced potatoes, sliced red onion and olive oil. Now I've gone slightly off piece with the recipe because I actually haven't peeled the potatoes. The skin have a lot of flavour, a lot of nutrients, and they are just great. So I try not to remove the skins unless I absolutely have to, or I specifically want a particular texture that the skin won't give. And to be frank, I can't be bothered. Also, it didn't actually have a step for cutting up the potatoes and peeling them, and also the onions, but it did say in the ingredients to cut these into 2.5 centimetre pieces and peel them, or peel them first and then cut them into 2.5 centimetre pieces. That would be easier. And also to cut the onion into wedges. I've actually used 2 smaller onions rather than 1 large onion. So let's put the oil all over this, and then we can toss the onion and potatoes in that oil, make sure it's all coated. Then it says to place our pork knuckle on top of the potatoes and onions, like so. Then it says pour the chicken stock or broth, as it says, around the pork knuckle, and because I'm using beer, the beer goes around as well. Now here we are over by the oven, and it says to cover it up with foil. I'll need a couple of sheets of this because it's a big old pan. And then it says to roast in the oven for 1.5 hours. So in that goes. So that's going to have that 1.5 hours in the oven under that foil. All that broth and beer is going to create a nice lot of steam to help that cook that pork and those vegetables. And then we can come back in 30 to 45 minutes, which I think I said earlier, 20 to 30. So that was a mistake on my part, but we'll come back and then it can have that uncovered for that amount of time, which will hopefully help crisp up those vegetables and also that pork knuckle, and hopefully get us a nice crispy skin. We'll see what it does. And I'm also going to try throwing in some frozen broccoli as well, which I'm letting defrost at room temperature, so I'm not throwing it in frozen. We'll see how that fares as well. But so far, so good. Let's see how we get on. Okay, it's been 1.5 hours, so I've taken the tray out of the oven, and now we can unwrap this, see how we're getting on, and then pop it back into the oven for about another half an hour, because it says between a half hour and 45 minutes, but let's give it a half hour and see how we get on. So let's take this off, see how we're doing. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. That is cooking quite nicely. Shuffle under, because what I want to do is I've got my broccoli here, the frozen broccoli, which is now pretty much defrosted. So I'm going to pop that around the corners. I have to say that is smelling really, really good so far. Those herbs and spices on that pork is smelling amazing. So I'm going to pop that back into the oven for another 30 minutes, see how we get on, and if it needs another 15 minutes, then I can give it another 15 minutes. Okay, it's been half hour. Let's see how we're getting on. Whew, yeah. Oh, that is looking pretty good. That could probably do with more time just looking at it though. Yeah, that could do with a bit longer because that skin isn't as crisp as I would like it to be yet, but it is smelling very, very good. I'm gonna move some of these veg around just so hopefully it's not getting stuck. Yep, I'm just gonna give that another 15 minutes, let that skin crisp up a little bit more, I think, and just give those veg a little bit more time, and then I think hopefully it'll be done. Right, I gave the pork knuckle another 15 minutes and it is out of the oven. I'm giving it some time to rest as per the recipe. And I've checked the temperature, it is cooked through. And also we've got the veg over here, which is looking cooked pretty nicely. We've got some nice charring on there, some nice golden color on the potatoes. Even the broccoli doesn't look too bad considering it was frozen and then put into the oven. It's got some nice charred bits on it as well, but it is not too mushy or anything like that, so that looks pretty good. Also, it all smells really good. So that's going to have a few more minutes to rest, and then I can cut into it and see how it turns out and see how it tastes. But seems like a pretty good effort so far. Okay, this has had a couple of minutes to rest, so I'm just going to try and cut some slices out of it. I've never cut a pork knuckle before, so I might make a hash of this, but I just want to try and get some of this off and see how we get into it. See if we can get some of the skin as well. That does look pretty nicely cooked, pretty nice and tender, very, very juicy. It's a pain in the ass to cut, that's for sure, but that is a nice and juicy bit of pork knuckle, so that does smell really great. So I'm going to cut a bit more off and get it onto a plate with some of the veg, and then I can give it a go and see how Chat GPT has done. There we go, I've got some of that pork knuckle served up there, along with that roasted veg. A pork knuckle recipe as written by an AI. Yeah, that was an interesting experiment. I want to see how it tastes because I really want to see how this has turned out. And it looks pretty good and it smells pretty good, but obviously the proof is always in the tasting. So let's give it a go. Let's get a bit of the pork knuckle here, which I've never had before, but I've heard good things. That tastes pretty good. Yeah, that was a little bit of a fatty bit, but the fat wasn't too chewy or anything. It's not like melting your mouth or anything like that, but it tastes good. It's a little bit on the salty side, so I think something to offset that would be good because, again, it's salty anyway. But you can get some of that garlic in there, you get some of the herbs as well, so that's nice. I really want to try and a bit with like the skin on, because I want to see how that turned out as well, because that's always the tricky part. So let's give that a try as well. So the skin isn't super crispy. It's a bit crisp, but it's still a bit on the chewy side. So you haven't got that really nice, like crispy, almost crackling like skin on it, which you would maybe get on like a pork belly or something like that. It could have probably done with longer, and it probably needs more processes to kind of get really crispy skin on it, because there wasn't much prep other than drying off the skin and the whole pork knuckle. But really it could maybe had done with the night in the fridge before, after it had been dried off, to kind of draw more of that moisture out of it, and hopefully then you would have got more of a crispy skin. So there was none of those steps or anything like that. But it wasn't bad, but not perfect by any means. Let's also try some of the veg here, because that looks pretty good. Get some potato, a bit of onion, and some of that broccoli as well. It's good roasted veg. What more do you want? You've got some of that flavour from the pork where it's been sitting on top of that veg as well, so those are really nice. So there you go, a pork knuckle recipe as written by an AI. And it wasn't bad in the end. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but given the limitation that is on it, I think it wasn't bad. I mean, I gave it 3 ingredients to work with for starters, maybe 4 once I said give it frozen vegetables, or 5 once I said add some beer to it, but that's something you can do with it. You can use it for inspiration and things that you've got around the place if you're stuck for ideas, which, you know, I kind of was. So it gave me a basis to work with. But it's not going to have a lot of those intricacies, that knowledge that people who are experienced with cooking with stuff is going to have. You know, based on how I've cooked things like that before, I would perhaps have more liquid in it, so it would kind of sit in that a bit more and make it even more tender. Have a little bit longer, maybe at a lower temperature, to kind of like help all that fat cook away so it's more melt in the mouth. So bits and pieces like that, things that you gather, like human beings gather as knowledge over time, where you kind of adjust things as you want them. It doesn't really have that. But as a way to kind of, you know, get inspiration, to get a recipe idea, it was really good. You know, it gave me a idea, and then I can build on that. You know, I could use things like mustard if I want to use extra flavour and stuff like that. But I wanted to see how it was in its like raw form, you know, just kind of like as it spat it out. And again, it wasn't bad. So overall, I am still quite impressed, because it gave a workable recipe, one that does still taste pretty good, and it allowed me to do all those things like, you know, check my equipment, convert it to metric as well. That's really useful. And it adjusts it as well based on the parameters you put into it. And it's only got to get better over time, because what I think it's doing is gathering from all the resources that it's got, probably millions and millions, and putting things together based on that information. And I don't know how up to date that information is, and it's probably going to have even more available to it in the future, and it'll probably be able to do an even better job as time goes on. So given where it's at now, that's still pretty impressive. Is it going to replace like actual chefs and, you know, recipe writers and things like that? No, at least certainly not now. So all in all, a pretty interesting experiment, I think. You know, I put 3 ingredients into it and got a tasty meal out of it. So yeah, it worked, and it's only going to get better, and I would like to try it again. So I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you found it entertaining. And if you did, obviously like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell to find out when new videos are going up. And I will see you next time on Big Foodie Geek, because I won't be going anywhere anytime soon, because I don't have to worry too much about AI at the moment, you know, superseding me, or Skynet coming into existence anytime soon. What the? Oh no. Ah, oh, damn it. Gotta go, bye! Hey, I'm back. Managed to get away from the Terminator. Apparently he was looking for a John Connor or something. Don't know, sucks to be him anyway. But I've eaten my pork knuckle meal, or a good portion of it, and one thing I will say, having eaten more of it, is it's quite salty, so there was nothing in there to balance out the salt, like I said earlier, and once you eat a bit more of it, that's very noticeable, and that is one thing, again, the AI didn't really counter for. You know, it could have said use something like honey or sugar or something to kind of balance that out, and it didn't have anything like that. And because it did go for store-cupboard ingredients, I did have stuff like honey and maple syrup and sugar and brown sugar and all types of sugar that could have balanced that out, but it didn't say to add anything like that. And personally, that is something I like to do with pork. You know, honey and mustard go very well, And that is probably something I would have done if I'd been doing the recipe all by myself. Again, I was trying to go by what the AI recipe told me, and it did end up a bit salty. Not inedible by any means, but it just did become noticeable the more you ate it. So it would have been like a small portion really that would have been better because of the salt in it. But ideally you would balance it out. So that is my quick update after having actually eaten it and tasted the whole thing. But again, all in all, I still think it's a pretty good experiment. Anyway, I'm really going now just in case the Terminator comes back and he couldn't find that John Connor bloke and he just wants to take it out on someone. So I will see you next time on Big Foodie Geek. Take care of yourselves. Looks like I've got a halo over my head. Yeah, if only.